to this early hour. Um, I know that's probably difficult. It's also difficult for me. It's quite late already on my side. Anyway, so today I will tell you about two things. As you see, my title is Models of Consciousness, Core Issues, and the Look Ahead. So there are two parts. And the first part is about a conference that I co-organized. And this year I had the special pleasure of being the main organizer, actually. And then in the second part of this talk, I will talk a little bit about my own research activities. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Models of Consciousness 6, that was the name of the conference. It happened in early October in Sapporo, Japan. And here you see all these um, kind of supporting institutions that we had. Um, I should mention the Center for Human Nature, AI, and Neuroscience, CHAIN, um, which was the local organization, and they really helped us in getting things off the ground in Japan locally. And I'm particularly thankful to my co-organizer, Keisuke Suzuki, who helped me really a lot. And without him, I guess this wouldn't all be possible. You also probably know, some of you know Johannes Kleiner. He also was in the seminar here. He's also part of the organizing team. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about our conference series. It's called Models of Consciousness, and we have an iteration of the conference every year, and then we change lead organizers every year and topics. Um, I would say the biggest overall goal that we had, or that I have, especially, was to kind of be inclusive and represent all topics in consciousness science. Some of you might be aware that these two big consciousness conferences, the Science of Consciousness conference in Tucson, which is run by Stu Hameroff, and the meeting of the Association for Scientific Study of Consciousness, the ASSC. And it's often, I would say, uh, the TSC conference, or the Science of Consciousness conference, is often conceived as a bit uh, liberal, let's put it this way. So they feature a lot of stuff, but sometimes it's not so clear whether the scientific soundness is so good. On the other hand, the ASSC conference is very conservative. They do good and kind of proper science, but sometimes it's a bit, the topic of consciousness is quite interesting, and it shouldn't be made into a kind of conservative conference. So we are trying to be somewhere in the middle, on the one hand being inclusive and featuring a lot of different approaches. There, of course, everyone in the organizing team has his own opinions, um, but overall, I would say different approaches to consciousness are very well represented at our conference. Another thing which is new, we did it for the first time last year in the conference in Bamberg, or 2 years ago now, in Bamberg, was to define core themes or core topics of this conference, in order to kind of structure the program a bit. And we continued with this with this structuring this year. And the three main topics that were discussed at the conference are philosophy of consciousness and mathematized phenomenology. I will tell you a little bit later about that, because that's relating to research that I'm doing. Then another core topic was quantum approaches to consciousness and their assumptions. I was particularly adamant that we should bring this topic. Um, in consciousness science, it's often quantum consciousness is sometimes a bit of a fringy topic, but I think there are many, many good ideas, and it's very important to make it sound and to make it scientifically rigorous. I think that's really something where our conference could play a good role in this whole field of consciousness studies. And then the last point, research on artificial consciousness. I'm pretty sure that you are aware of this. There is a lot of hype, or a lot of kind of interest in AI these days, and people are talking about AI consciousness. Now there's some pro arguments, there's some contra arguments, but I think irrespective of your particular position, of one's particular position, that's a very important topic. It might have a big impact on society. It's in a bit of a lamentable state, in the sense that there's a lot of media attention um, but a real sound, scientific, rigorous basis is actually missing. So people are often, I don't know, claiming various things, and it's not so clear how good the science behind those things really is. So that's a topic which we kind of want to concentrate on in our conference. And last point, last general point about the conference, we conceived it since the very first installment as an interactive conference. So we have these discussion sections, structured discussion sections, which I think are very important and which are probably the biggest part of this conference series. Um, Now here it's just, I don't go through all the text here, but it's just to give you a kind of impression of the topics that we discussed and the kind of talks that we have or the people that we had. Actually, you don't see the talk titles, but the people and the topics. So that was the conference, which was stretched over 4 days. And now I will just talk a little bit about some personal highlights of the conference, structured along those three topics that I mentioned before. And the first thing which I wanted to start is quantum approaches to consciousness. There were a couple of talks actually on this topic, quantum approaches to consciousness. I I just want to mention a few here. I think in 2 weeks or so, there will be a talk by Chris. So I won't talk too much about this. I just flag this here, and I kind of recommend you all going to his Chris talk. I think that was one of the very good talks that I heard at the conference. When you're interested in quantum approaches to consciousness, there are basically two or two and a half approaches that you could take, or two and a half routes to quantum consciousness. And one is actually doing quantum biology or quantum brain biology. So looking at quantum effects, if you like, this kind of metaphor with software and hardware, to look for quantum effects in the hardware of the brain. And that would be quantum biology or quantum consciousness. And in Chris's talk, you will get a good overview of approaches in this area. So with that, I don't say much more about this. I want to say something about the kind of complementary or second approach to quantum consciousness, which is actually quantum cognition, which is a bit more interested in this high level cognitive or perceptual description of phenomena. So the idea here is not to look for specific quantum effects in the biological substrate, but to kind of think about the overall structure of cognition or use the mathematical tools, the mathematical structure of quantum theory to talk about cognitive or perceptual effects. And we also had two mini sessions actually on that topic. So for example, here there was a mini session led by Peter Bruser from Queensland. And I'm always impressed by the kind of richness of phenomena people are talking about in quantum cognition. There are various kinds of effects in cognitive science and in perception science that people kind of treated with these quantum tools and produced some very interesting results. And last but not least, the third approach to this whole quantum consciousness topic goes slightly differently. It doesn't look specifically at quantum stuff, but it says, okay, let's try to get to a theory of consciousness and then develop quantum theory out of that. And this approach was represented by Chetan Prakash, a friend of mine, who works on conscious agent theory with Don Hoffman, which you might have heard about. So the idea would be to define a conscious agent or a network of conscious agents and look what quantum or quantum-like properties you can observe or you can mathematically extract from those networks. Okay, second topic, research on artificial consciousness. Now, one thing that surprised me about that one, or which pleasantly surprised me about that one actually, was that there are so many different opinions on which direction to go. And those are 4 slides or 4 excerpts from slides from invited speakers at our conference, and they all had a slightly different approach to this question of AI consciousness. So first, it was maybe the highlight, my personal highlight, the best talk that I had was by Takashi Ikegami from the University of Tokyo, from prediction machine to individual, constructive consciousness and informational synergy in the Android Altair 3. I think it was a very good talk, not because I necessarily buy into the assumptions here, but because I just think the talk was very good and gave me a lot of kind of impressions, a lot of material, a lot of stuff to think about. And the approach to artificial consciousness that was taken in that talk is actually to look at robots and control systems of robots. So large language models are important in the sense that they are one part of this control system of the robot. So it's close to something which could be called an embodied approach to AI, mainly going to consciousness via robotics. There was a very different talk by Susan Schneider from Florida Atlantic University, who is very skeptical about these prospects of digital consciousness, so digital computation leading to consciousness. She's more open to what's sometimes known as biological or called biological computation, for example, neuromorphic computation, or you might have heard of this thing which is called model computation. We can talk later a little bit about that one. So Susan basically had this idea that, okay, today's chatbots are not conscious, but biological ones may be. Okay, now a third approach was by represented by Ryota Kanai from Araya. He gave a talk with the title Qualia and Symmetry, which was part of a larger research program, and that's maybe the most mainstream approach in this area. Well, if you can speak of mainstream approaches actually with this topic, which comes under the name of computational functionalism, where the question of consciousness boils down to this question whether you could implement the right functions on a digital system. So, for example, whether you could implement a global workspace architecture on a computer, or some integrated information processing, recurrent processing in such a system. And that's again a different approach to AI consciousness. And the fourth one, which I want to mention, that was not specifically about AI consciousness, but I think there's a very strong relation to this question, was a talk by Tom Fröse. I'm not sure whether he himself gave a talk at this seminar, but he was in the seminar. He gave a talk about his theory, which is called eruption theory, which is a kind of very different framework to consciousness, to understanding the mind-matter relation more generally. Maybe if you like philosophical classifications, I would say it's a kind of dual aspect approach to consciousness. And I found that very interesting, or the theory in itself very interesting, but also Tom very interesting because he used to be a prime proponent of embodied approaches to AI, so embodiment and activism and so on. But he's now a bit skeptical about that. And I think that makes for a very interesting mix of ideas. Okay, finally, the last big topic is about philosophy of consciousness and mathematized phenomenology. So the idea, philosophy of consciousness in this whole, with respect to these models of consciousness ideas, would be to say, okay, what are the basic conceptual and mathematical assumptions behind those things which were discussed? And maybe how can we relate those assumptions to more formal models of studying things? So first talk that I want to highlight here was a talk by Shigeru Taguchi. He's the director of CHAIN, the Center for Human Nature and AI and Neuroscience, that kind of supported the conference. He gave a talk, A Monoid Model of Consciousness, which is about connecting one approach from connecting ideas from phenomenology, which is a part of philosophy, to category theory, which is an abstract mathematical framework. A second talk in this topic, under this topic, was by Yuko Ishihara. She's a professor at the College of Global Liberal Arts at Risumaken University, and she talked about Nishida Kitaro. He was a famous Japanese philosopher. You might have heard about him. And she tried to make the case that a lot of ideas that you can find in Nishida are relevant for this project of mathematical models of consciousness. And last but not least, I just want to mention my own talk. It was called Interface Consciousness, and the idea, or the subtitle, consciousness is reconceived as the phenomenological bridge enacted through an agent's interface with reality. It's a bit complicated. I will break it down in a minute. Just for your interest, it's current research that I'm doing. If you're interested in that, you can look at the website or at the QR code on the screen. Now, what is it? Maybe some kind of brief biographical remarks about my research trajectory. Um, as some of you might know, I did my first postdoc with Donald Hoffman at the University of California in Irvine, and I worked on the so-called interface theory of perception, which assumes that perceptions are utility related, for example, fitness related representations of the objective world out there. So the things that we see are not objectively given to us, but they are kind of constructed in order to enhance survival or whatever interests you. In my second postdoc, I was based for 2 years at the University of Munich, where I mainly studied mathematized phenomenology, which is the idea of trying to come up with mathematical models to model first-person subjective experience, or more closely interact with a philosophical subdiscipline of the early 20th century, which is called phenomenology. And now I'm interested in merging those two approaches. There are two comments. The first is actually a comment, and the second is a question. The comment is that irrespective where you come from, whether it's from the interface side or from the phenomenology side, it's, I think, important to realize that this whole business of doing models of consciousness is about relating or mediating objective and subjective processes. So often there's a slightly wrong conception, for example, about phenomenology, which is just assumed to be just, quotation marks, just the study of subjective experience. There's some truth to it, of course, but it's also about how subjective experience can be related to some objective stuff. And the same is true for the interface theory of perception. Normally, if you think about cognitive neuroscience, for example, you would say, okay, it's about some objective stuff that's going on in brains, but that's not quite the full story. If you accept this idea that both theories are about mediating objective and subjective processes, then the natural question that actually arises from that is to say, okay, you have these interfaces. How can we study or how can we make sense of phenomenologically structured interfaces to specific occurrences of specific variants of these interfaces? And that's my current research, or that's related to the current research projects that I'm doing at my university. And I just give you a little kind of glimpse into what I'm doing there. There's a lot of work in progress, so there's a certain caveat here. Anyway, okay, so that's the basic program. Or the basic idea, modeling interfaces with what I call Q networks. So one natural question is, what are these interfaces and how can we make the talk of those interfaces more precise? Now, if you look at consciousness science, what has been done in consciousness science over the last, let's say, 30 years or so, most approaches actually are what I would call generative or constructive. So they start with certain processes, usually some processes in the brain, and then they try to come up with something that is, I don't know, that is related to consciousness or that resembles consciousness. And those approaches actually did not very well. I think they failed miserably. Now, in this approach, modeling interfaces with Q networks actually methodologically go in the opposite direction. So we start with experience and try to connect to physics. And what I mean by that is to say, okay, you have something like a data structure, which is defined by the constraints that are given to you from phenomenology. And then we try to embed physical or physiological data into these data structures and see how far we can go there. And specifically, there's a three-step approach that I take. If you have certain data from measurements, I'm very excited actually by measurements from biology, like cells and single cells even, and reaction networks, and I don't know, but that's a bit more speculative, so maybe brains, possibly also AIs. You would try to embed those data into what I call a phenomenal space, which is a mathematical representation of phenomenology, of phenomenological structures, where each data point would correspond to a point in such a space. So I will just give a concrete example. If you have a time series, of measurements. Then you would say, okay, each time slice corresponds to one particular point in your embedding, to a vector in your embedding. And if you have defined it that way, you can then start to define networks on top of this space. And a simple way of doing that would be to say, okay, each node of the network corresponds to one of those data points, and the relations or the links, the edges between those nodes are given to you by your embedding, by spatial relations dictated by your embedding. So you would have in a second stage, you would have a network defined on these phenomenal spaces, which I call Q networks. And then in a third and last space, you could either make it a bit more complicated and invoke category theory. I wrote a paper about that. I won't talk much about it, or you go a little bit more, you take it a little simpler. You just try to quantify what's happening in your networks. And typically you would want to have something like global to local properties. So for those of you who are interested in that kind of stuff, you can study something like you can do something like a topological data analysis on top of your networks and compute Betty numbers. So there's a categorical representation, correspondence to that, and I think there's a very nice phenomenological equivalent to that as well. Now, to give you a very concrete example, and that's the real current thing which I'm doing and the work in progress that I'm doing, one could ask this question, well, what's a good test case for this whole theory, for this whole apparatus? And I just said, like biological stuff may be a bit too speculative. With AI, you don't really know what you're doing. So maybe let's just have it easy and focus on the human brain. Unfortunately, today the technological advantage is on my side. There are these nice people who produce these incredibly useful data sets which are open and which you could just download and play with, and that's what I did here. So there's the data set which is about a Pixar movie. So subjects were shown a little movie, 3 minutes I think, of a Pixar movie. That's a cartoon movie, and while they watched this movie, they were put into an fMRI scanner, and the fMRI scanner recorded something or recorded their neural activity. And then in this study, they tried to correlate what they found in their scanner with the kind of movie or with the events which they which were well pronounced in this movie. Okay, so if you see that data from a kind of phenomenological or consciousness researcher perspective, there are a couple of questions which immediately might come or might spring to your mind. First question is about time consciousness, whether the time in the movie stands in one-to-one correspondence to what's happening in your brain, or whether that stands in one-to-one correspondence to what you actually experience. We usually assume something like that, but that's not clear that this is really the case. And so that's one of the targets which interest me very much. That's related to a second point. Now I can't see it because because of the screen, but I think it says something like contextuality there on the slide, which basically means that within a certain duration of your experience, it's not so clear what this duration actually is. It could be, and phenomenologists typically would argue actually that this is the case, that certain experiences, different possible experiences or different past experiences might affect each other. And what you experience momentarily is dependent on the things that you also experienced previously. And I would take the most extreme position, which I call a kind of Leibnizian position. There's this philosopher, Gottfried Leibniz, who had this kind of interesting, or some say crazy, I say interesting, model of monads, where everything relates to everything. So in the most extreme cases, every event that you would see in the movie has an impact on your subjective experience while seeing that movie. Okay, so that's the basic kind of setup that I'm working with, or the basic data that I'm actually working with. Now, how do I proceed? And it's the work in progress. The first part of the work in progress, the first thing would be mapping imaging data or brain activities onto what's called regions of interest. That's a very standard thing. And there's a lot actually what was already done in the work. And then in the second step, embedding this time series data into these phenomenal spaces. And here you see an image of a of a three-dimensional projection of a seven-dimensional embedding space. And if you have defined such an embedding, you can then construct a network in the second step. You can see that here. So each point or each dot represents one data point, and there are certain relations between those data points, which are given by similarity relations, basically just dot products in your embedding space. And the idea would be then in a third step to analyze these networks, for example, doing a topological data analysis, varying this similarity threshold, and then computing certain kind of quantities that characterize these networks, and then compare a local to a global version in the very last step. So if you have that, what I just said, there are very interesting research questions that you could actually then specify with these tools. So for example, whether semi-local network quantities, the stuff that I just talked about, complement temporal analyses. So this reverse correlation, that's the name which they used in this paper that I showed. I didn't explain what reverse correlation is, but it's just a correlation between what happened in the brain and what's happening in the movie. Semi-local just means that you look at subnetworks and compute those quantities on subnetworks and compare what happens in the subnetworks with, for example, what happens at a single point in time. You compare the temporal analysis, which was done in the paper already, with a more structural analysis, which is driven by insight from phenomenology, which I propose here. You could even ask this question whether those network quantities predict movie events better than this reverse correlation process does. So whether that speaks against this one-to-one correspondence between what's happening in the brain and what's happening in your mind. And follow-up question that would be, or one question under this rubric would be whether this tells us anything about time consciousness. And if you're really brave, you could even try to do some prediction. And again, the technological development is very much in my favor or in our favor. In this case, one could simply train an artificial neural network to do this. And it's actually not a very difficult, might be tedious, might take a grad students a few days, but it could in principle be done. And in the future, what you could do if you're really confident, you could try to make a prediction if you have a certain piece of, let's say, people in a scanner, and you want to predict what will they experience next, then you could try to predict that with this formalism, under the assumption that there's a certain lawful relation between current experiences, action, and future experiences. And with that, okay, perfect. I thank you very much. I'm finished with my talk for today. I think it's very early and quite late for me. So I thank you very much all for coming. And I thank you for your attention. And I hope that was somehow interesting to you. And look forward to any questions.